Okay, welcome everyone. We're so pleased to be learning alongside all of y'all today to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Before you go from 0 to 100, do your homework. So this is a loaded topic, and the time we have today is by no means sufficient, but we will do our best. So my name is Dr. Sarah Saska. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Feminuity. And thankfully today, I'm joined by two very thoughtful practitioners to help tackle this big, juicy topic. So I will pass the digital mic to Shav first, and then Dave.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Hasfal-McIntosh, Shavonne Hasfal-McIntosh, but everybody calls me Shav, and I'm diversity and belonging lead at Shopify. And I also do some community work with organizations like Accelerate Her Future, Invest Ottawa, and Manifesto.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Doyen. I work as a diversity and inclusion consultant. Most of my work is actually in community with tackling anti-Black racism, whether that be in policing, child welfare, healthcare, and even the venture capital and private equity space. And I love roller coasters and chocolate.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you to you both. So more from Shav and Dave shortly. But before we get into it, I'm just going to set the stage just a little bit for anyone who's sort of not up to speed on, I guess, the recent developments in the field. So we know that since the death of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion has witnessed a spike in interest from organizations across the globe. Many companies are waking up to the reality that these efforts are a true driver of their brand, of their product, and of employee engagement, and that ultimately these efforts are simply what's expected of organizations in 2020 and beyond. So while those of us in the field, in many ways, are heartened to see this spike in interest, it's certainly not without many, many complexities. So our organization, Feminuity, we've received an 800% increase in inbound requests over the past 3 or 4 months, and the requests have been decidedly mixed. Right? We've witnessed the knee-jerk reactions of many organizations, often asking us to kick off an effort, within 24 hours or something even shorter. Many are looking for quick fixes or one-and-done solutions. And the most common request is for a single workshop where they want to sort of check the proverbial box and appease those applying pressure to their organization. Another really common request for those who have a sense that this work requires more than a one-off workshop and seeks to support it to determine whether to hire a leader in-house, such as a chief diversity officer, to quote-unquote solve the problem, or whether they might pay external consultants to do some of that heavy lifting. So while the intentions behind this might be noble, there really are some critical questions that we want to see companies consider before rushing to do anything. While this may sound a little bit contrary to what you might expect from practitioners in the field, we really need organizations to be thoughtful in their approach. We know that all of these types of changes take time and dedication, and that this work is likely to be one of the most complex challenges faced by most organizations. So thankfully, we have two really thoughtful practitioners here to highlight some of these critical questions and provide some insight from their own unique perspectives. So the first question that we're going to tackle today, and I will open up to Shav and Dave, is as follows. So for organizations that are just starting out on their journey, we really want them to slow down, take a pause, and be intentional about this process. So what is the most critical question that you hope that these organizations ask themselves before shifting into action? So Shav, could we start with you?
Sure. I think one of the things that I think is most critical is for an organization to just pause and reflect, and kind of for the leaders to hold up the mirror to themselves to see the way that we created our company or our culture, could that have been built in a way that could have potentially caused harm for people from underrepresented groups, and then be willing to change it. I think for a lot of CEOs, a lot of founders, a lot of people who are in the C-suite, the way they build their companies is deeply personal to them. We have something called the founder's mentality, where they hold really fast to the way in which they've built their organizations. And in a lot of cases, leaders aren't willing to do what it takes to actually build equitable businesses. They are not comfortable being able to, or having to, or being called to do that self-reflection work. They're not comfortable or open to admitting that maybe they have done so or built a company that isn't equitable, where inclusive environments aren't possible, where their workforce is not diverse. So I think the one thing that I ask these organizations to do is for that senior leadership group to really reflect and be willing to admit that maybe they were wrong, or maybe they have built their companies in a way that is not equitable, and then be willing to change that, or at least have that conversation around what change could look like for them.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Dave?
For me, I think the most critical question is, why do you want to do this? For a lot of people, it's, as you say, it is a knee-jerk response, and no one has taken that time to do the necessary reflection. For a lot of people, if they have been familiar with this, it's talking about the business case for diversity and inclusion. And I think it's time to not set that aside, but to also talk about the moral persuasion, the cost of discrimination, which a lot of people don't actually talk about, the impact of being discriminated against, and what that does to those who live in, when we talk about, if we focus on anti-Black racism and how it is we've gotten to this moment, what it means to live in Black skin, not just as a person, but as an employee. The same for Indigenous peoples, right? When you step into the workplace, are you treated differently, and what does that look like? And we can talk about several other dimensions of diversity. In that question of why you want to do this, they also need to ask themselves, who's going to own it? And if the ownership is just within the HR team and not even senior leadership, then it's already being set up for failure. It has to be owned by the CEO, and it needs to be owned by the rest of the executive, but primarily the CEO. Without that voice to champion it, it's really falling on deaf ears as another HR project.
Okay. So thank you to you both. So Shav, I'm hearing you, right? You really want them to sort of hold up that mirror and reflect and dig in deep, right? Ask themselves some of those hard questions. And Dave, you want to ask them why the heck they want to do this, and why now, and who's going to lead that, and what's that going to look like? So yeah, so with those sort of questions, I guess asked, and having a bit more of a fulsome understanding around that, where would you want organizations to go next, right? Once they have the answer to those questions, what's their next move? Where do they go from there?
I mean, I think Dave touched on some of those things, and I would agree with that. I think that one thing that's important as a next step, or what they should do next, is understand the role that they're going to play in this work. Like Dave has said, not one team of 4 to 5 people, or not one team of 1, or not even one team of an HR team of 100 is going to be able to do this in a way that addresses the systemic issues that exist within your organization. So for me, Dave touched on it in his this is the first critical step, but for me that is the second one, which is what is the accountability of me in this work? What am I going to do as a CEO and as an exec team to drive this work forward? And then I think, adding on to that, it's how are you going to hold people accountable? This is the one thing that is constantly missing. You have all these programs, you have all these people, you have all these workshops, and it's just at the end of the day, how are people being held accountable to doing this? In too many organizations, people are continuously building homogenous teams, and there's too much times traditionally people are not being paid equitably, and there's no repercussions for any of that. It just kind of you continue to move up the ladder, you continue to become a director, and then a VP, and then a CEO. But that's the big thing that's missing, whether it's through the form of KPIs or OKRs, or just like very clear expectations set out by the CEO to the business that accountability must exist. Otherwise, we're going to be having the same conversations year over year. Otherwise, your organizations are going to be looking the same year over year. And otherwise, the harm and the inequities for people from underrepresented groups will be perpetuated year over year. So that'd be my big one.
For me, I've seen a lot of organizations jump to creating or establishing a diversity and inclusion committee or council, and they become the consultative body in terms of what the organization will do next, and they're tasked with developing that roadmap and the strategy. And I would say even before you get there, because generally the persons who will answer that call to join such a committee or such a body are the people who are very passionate about diversity and inclusion. But we need to always keep in mind those who are sitting elsewhere on the spectrum, in terms of those who may be critics or skeptics of diversity and inclusion, those who do have some knowledge, those who, and wherever else they may sit on the spectrum, because everyone needs space in this field. And the reason I say that is the next step for me has to be what I call a listening tour, really engaging the organization in open, honest, and candid conversation about who is not feeling attached to this culture, who has felt excluded by the culture of this organization, who has felt left out of the various processes in terms of rewards and recognition, how we pay people, and who's brought into the organization, and who do we see leaving at a disproportionate rate compared to others. And that comes to bear through the stories of people when we create those spaces for conversation to say, listen, we're ready and willing to do that critical reflection, and that's only possible with your participation. In this time, as we, when you look at social media and other places and news reports, you're seeing more and more stories of Black individuals and other racialized folks who are talking about how they've been mistreated in their organizations, the racial harassment that they've been suffering that they've kept to themselves. So I've been telling people that we are where we are because Black folks have been doing a lot of holding it in and holding it up. We've denied ourselves the opportunity to share our stories and share the burdens that we've been living with, because it's going to be met with negations of racism, and you just don't want to play that game. And so the easier thing is to just not say to anyone, and you don't risk being branded a radical or someone who it does not fit in with this culture because it's somehow controversial or taboo to discuss these subjects here. But I think in this moment, what we've learned with, our dear brother George Floyd being what we call the straw that broke the camel's back, there's a lot that hasn't been discussed that needs to be discussed. It has been the pink elephant in the room that has been calling us to conversation. So we need to create spaces for open, honest, and candid conversation, and then we can start to build up the next steps. Because for me, diversity and inclusion can't just be about what experts think it should be. It has to be responsive to the needs of the people in the organization, particularly those who are most disadvantaged.
Yeah, and I just want to build on that quickly because I think that's so important, and something that Feminuity does really well is you can have facilitated conversations, but you can also do an audit through surveying people so that they are not tasked with having to necessarily face their oppressor in a face-to-face interaction where they might not feel safe. So I like the idea of being able to facilitate roundtables and have open dialogue and conversation, and then alternatively being able to survey even anonymously potentially to also understand and create another option for people who might not feel comfortable speaking up and speaking out.
Yeah, okay, thank you to you both there. So Shav, I hear you. You want to really get clear on what does accountability look like, right? How we're going to hold our people accountable. What might accountability look like in terms of finances and other sort of resources and allocations even, right? And Dave, sort of listening to her, right? You want to sort of unearth the voices, create space for voices that have for too long not been heard, and sort of let this be sort of a co-design process, right? Where inputs are sort of brought from across the organization. So this leads me to my next question then. Once an organization is sort of clear on what accountability will look like for folks, and you've gone through that process of collecting that data, that information, perhaps conducting that listening tour, then how do you move from there, right? How do you determine whether, as an organization, if this is, your first foray into this work, how do you determine if you should hire a chief diversity officer or a related role, so with a DEI practitioner, perhaps at any level, or an external consultants, right? How does an organization determine what's the right fit for them?
I'll let Dave go first.
You know what? For me, the title and the role itself doesn't even matter. It's about whether the organization is going to adequately resource the role with the necessary funding, and not just the funding, but the support to ensure that the initiatives are executed in the spirit that they were intended, with also guidance from leadership that demonstrates that we are committed to and are serious about cultural change. When you think about, I'll give you an example. Following the calls to action released by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, many universities have been hiring advisors on Indigenous affairs and Indigenous student affairs, and that person reports to the president or the principal of the university, whatever their version of a CEO may be in their org chart. And that person may or may not be a member of the senior leadership team, right? May or may not sit on the C-suite or their version of leadership in the university space. It's about, but I think what is necessary is that whatever this role is or whatever the title is, that person is reporting to the CEO because of the signal it sends that this is important to the organization, of that we're not just thinking about it from an HR perspective, but that we want it embedded across the organization, to think about it from the perspective of our marketplace, the consumers, and the products and services we offer. So it doesn't just get locked into an HR focus.
Yeah, I'll say here. I think that role definitely should report out of HR. I think HR kind of provides this glass ceiling in terms of the scope of the work and the strategic scope of the work, and putting it right into the CEO, like you said, Dave, makes a very, very strong statement. I also agree with you. There are a lot of organizations hiring DEI people, whether again they're directors, VPs, chief diversity officers, etc. And a lot of the companies who are hiring for this role are just they're just going to be one person. You're by yourself. You got to make it work or it won't work. And after a year, we'll sit back down with you to review if you should have more people or you should not. And I think that's putting a very, again, it's a ceiling. It's putting a limit on this work. You need to be able to resource that person adequately. You need to be able to compensate that person adequately as well. And you need to ensure that, again, the leadership team is bought in to the work that's being done. And if you can't afford a full-time person, I think then you can go into the way of looking for a consultant to be able to do that work and set up some of those foundational pieces for you. But I think, how can you resource? Can you resource? I think if you're really, really on your journey, also the consultant could be the way to go for you. If you're just I don't even know where to start. But I think that you need to hire somebody to guide this work. And I won't go too deep into that, but I don't think your human resources person or your recruiter or a committee can really do this work. If you're really trying to create systemic change, you need to have a function and you need to have a dedicated resource to dig into this stuff.
Yeah, if you will just permit me one quick addition. For a lot of organizations, they wait until they're of a certain size and scale. And understandably, that's because of budgets, right? Financial constraints on the organization. You can't pay for every single role that you'd like when you're just starting off. But if we're serious about diversity and inclusion, we have to think of it as a business essential role, because it's hard to effect cultural change when you've already hired a lot of people, because behaviors, norms, and habits get established. And so, the process of unlearning can be very difficult to do. So we have to think about how we're going to create a culture and bring on those experts from the get-go, not after the horse has left the barn, because to take the corrective steps is a little bit harder. It's not impossible, it's just harder to do. So really try and prioritize the role as much as you can. Carve out a little room for in your budget to bring on an expert, whether they're full-time or part-time, or Shav said, consultant.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing now is like a lot of organizations, they're hiring these roles reactively because something has happened or they've been called out. Like, and we're seeing that stuff happening on social media time over time. So if you, like Dave suggested, get somebody in this role from the very beginning, they could probably mitigate the risk of like some of those missteps from happening. It's a very, very worthwhile investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this leads perfectly into our next question. What the heck is the difference between a chief diversity officer or a DEI practitioner and an HR people leader, right? I think the average organization is still struggling to really understand the differences, right? So can you both sort of in your own words help folks to understand better what a CDO or a DEI practitioner really does, like just like the full depth and breadth of the work and what that kind of looks like?
I think one of the challenges is that it has come to be seen as an HR role because in the vast majority of organizations, it's embedded as part of the HR team. So it can be looked at as a specialty of HR, as we do with compensation, human resources, information specialists, right? Those persons who do the systems management. And sometimes even within HR teams, you have project managers, right, that have a variety of skills. So if you're just going to have a workforce focus with your diversity and inclusion efforts, then you can be seen as an HR person. There is also thinking about how diversity shows up, as I said, externally through the marketplace, your corporate social responsibility efforts, your consumers, the products and services, and then it will start to take on a different tone. So, for example, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, recently shared their D&I strategy where news and content is concerned. So that can look different because it's about the voices that are on air, the movies, the content, the programming that starts to get distributed and made available to the public. So it can be either as a content, a subject matter expert where HR is concerned, or it can be looked at as just someone bringing a different lens depending on the business line and the work that's being done there.
Yeah, and I like to compare it to different types of engineers. Like if you're a civil engineer or a chemical engineer, or if you're like a mechanical engineer, you're different. You have different levels of expertise. So just because we're in HR, not all HR functions know the depth of the subject matter expertise, and so I use different types of not all engineers are the same. Not all HR people are the same. Engineers have subject matter expertise, areas of subject matter expertise. So do HR people. So it's not enough for someone who just works with people to be able to take on the work of this. Even people who are in the DEI space, who are practitioners, the learning is constant and it's our sole focus, and it's still, you're learning every single day. So to put that on the plate of somebody who's also recruiting, who's also dealing with employee relations issues, they won't have the capacity or bandwidth to go deep enough, and again, to understand systemically. I do think it's important for people across an organization. So I think it's important for all HR people to have the lens of diversity and inclusion, belonging, equity, justice, so that as they're building these people practices and these foundational pieces, they can take that into consideration. But I don't think that it would be good enough for somebody to have many facets. I think a DEI practitioner is a very specific skill set that can be developed over time, but cannot be substituted by just any person who's in HR.
Agreed.
Yeah, we like to talk about CDOs and the work of such folks as being deeply cross-functional, right? They need to pay attention to everything from pay equity through to product inclusion to physical and digital accessibility and beyond, right? It's a really, for us, it's about having a full 360 on an organization at any given time, and it doesn't mean that one CDO practitioner is going to be good at all elements, right, of that business. That's why this work needs to be led by teams and be, owned by people across an organization in a really robust way, because it's just simply not possible for one person to do it all and to do it all really well. Okay, so I know we only have just a couple minutes left, but so I'd love to open the space for you to both share anything that's just really resonating with you right now. Like, so do you have any sort of, your best advice for organizations who are just starting on their journey? Maybe a quotation or someone you want them to follow, or just like, this deep sort of secret that you want the world to know.
Ooh, not so good in the scope of quotes, but there's so much advice. I think for me, the biggest piece of advice I would have for organizations just starting out on their journey is to understand that change will not happen overnight. And the change might not happen in 6 months, but the change will come if you have a strategy, you have the right people supporting and role, and you have committed to this work. I've just talked to people who are hiring people within their organization to take on this work, and they're just like, yeah, we'll be able to see an increase in 6 months to a year, and we'll build a team around it, and that'll be that. And you're literally dismantling centuries of systemic oppressions and racism from your processes, and they do exist. It happens. They're built right into your systems. It happens whenever you have people coming together in an organization. These issues will arise. So I would say that it's not going to happen overnight. The change will not happen overnight, but it will happen, and it takes time. And I think that would be my best advice for organizations, to stay the course.
For me, it's making sure that the white men in our organizations are just as engaged. White men have been shamed and blamed in this field in particular. And so the default response becomes that they opt out, that they just stay away from it. And if we think of them as the most powerful, as the power brokers, the most powerful demographic out there, it's not good enough for them to just have them at the sidelines because, yes, patriarchy and the histories of oppression that exist there, they need to be a part of the doing and learning journey. And that doesn't happen richly, doesn't happen well if they're just on the sidelines and they only go to them when we need to resource our initiatives and we need their help and support. They need to be actively engaged so that they're learning from the people who are at the table, sharing their stories and lived experiences. So I really do encourage organizations to make sure that they feel included, that they feel invited. And it can be hard because someone will be saying, how much more inclusion do they need when they've had the benefits of everything else? The reality is they're struggling with whether they have any role to play in this field because it's not designed about them, it's not designed around them. But some encouragement, some invitation does go a long way. The same way people may think Black History Month is just for Black people, or that if you go to a powwow, it's only for Indigenous peoples. Truth be told, both groups, Black folks, Indigenous peoples, are welcoming you and are requesting and are inviting you to come and be a part of those events, be a part of those experiences. The same with events about women. Sometimes they may be for closed spaces, but more often than not, it's actually asking and inviting men to also be a part of that learning, to better understand the challenges that have been confronting women, so they can also start to think about their role in removing some of those barriers. So, let's make sure we still keep them at the table and keep them engaged.
Okay. Awesome. So Shav is really reminding us, right, that this work is a long, sustained journey, right? We're not going to see big shifts overnight, right? We're going to see incremental, sustained growth and progress, right? So it very much is about persistence and progress over perfection and immediate results. And Dave, you want us to call in the skeptics, the folks with, who are part of dominant groups, all sorts, right? So the white men, like heterosexual folks, like non-disabled folks, right? Like the folks who feel like they don't have a role in this. And really, you want to really help show everyone that they do have a part in this, right? That all of us can leverage our own relative power and privilege in really interesting and unique ways, right? To actually move this along. So, cool. Well, I feel like our time is probably up here. So we're going to open space for folks to ask questions, and we'll share answers in the text box and through the platform generally. So Shav, Dave, anything else you want to offer before we open space for folks to ask questions?
No, I think we covered something. I always say pause, reflect, learn, unlearn, relearn, take action. It doesn't have to go exactly in that order, but
it may even loop back, right? You may hit one and go back and retrace your steps.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll open time for questions.